Hey folks, welcome in. This is Chris with Alpenglow Digital, and in today's video, we are going to dive a little bit deeper into the date and time picker within Power Apps. In front of us, we have three different versions of essentially the same form. It's connected to a SharePoint list on the back end, and we just brought in a couple fields to illustrate the difference in formatting and functionality of the date and time picker. At the top here, if you do not have modern themes enabled within Power Apps, you'll see this format. If you do have modern themes enabled, you will see this format. Both of these default to a 24-hour hour picker. And what we find for a lot of our clients and internal stakeholders is that they really prefer, if they're going to specify a date and time, they prefer for it to be on the 12-hour clock, which we have here, and with an AM or a PM designation. So what we've built here is a 12-hour hour picker. We've restricted the minute picker to just be on the quarter hour. And then we've added an AM and PM selector. And once we have that hooked up, we talk a little bit about how to translate kind of this new data format into a date and time that Power Apps and SharePoint understand so that you can successfully submit this in the correct format. So without further ado, let's go. Hey folks, welcome into Power Apps. Let's do a quick overview of what all is in this application before we get started building our ultimate final date and time picker. We're going to create essentially three versions of the same form. This is referencing a SharePoint list in the background that we've used for other videos, kind of pretending to be an event planning company. And so for the sake of this video, we don't have all of our fields. We're just going to use event title and date and time. This is the out-of-the-box form when you do not have modern controls and themes set up. In a second, we're going to turn on modern controls and themes and create the same form so you can see how the formatting differs. And then lastly, with still modern themes and controls set up, we're going to create the final version of our date and time picker, which has an AM and PM dropdown and uses 1 through 12 for the hours. Let's build the second version of this form, which is going to be the same two fields, except we are going to use the modern controls and themes. So to turn those on, you can come up to the settings at the top of your screen, click the Updates tab, and then right here on the New tab, you will see Modern Controls and Themes. If we toggle that on, it will not go through and change any of your existing elements, such as buttons or form elements like labels and fields, because now you will see some additional items in your insert options, but you'll also see some of the old items. And so what do they call these? Sometimes they call these classic. Yeah. So you'll see a lot of these non-modern themes and controls under the classic, like text label, but now we have something called text, which is just the kind of the new version of text label, if you will. And so where we previously had, I think, both a display form and an edit form option prior to modern being enabled, we now just have a form option. So if we click form, we already have our data source hooked up. So I'm going to select that same data source, and really briefly, I'm going to delete all of the fields that we don't care about. So we're not going to have description here. We're going to have type event, guests, content type. So we just have the same two fields. And so you'll notice right away, let me try to format this, that things look quite a bit different than they did in the above form. They're much smaller out of the box. You also have your labels bolded. And if you were to play this, a classic example of what happens when you forget to change the default mode to new. Now, if you play this, when you click in, you can kind of see this nice underline effect. And then the date and time picker is a little bit different. So this is huge. One of my complaints early on was that you can't style this in the default non-modern themes and controls, and it just takes up a huge portion of the screen. So the new one is a little bit sleeker, I think. So same idea. You can still pick date. You can really quickly get to future dates or past dates by month, which is great. And then the same options. Granted, you can see the styling is just a little bit different. They really like rounded corners, and everything kind of has that blue underline. So very similar, again, in terms of functionality to the old controls, but with just a sleeker look. All right, all we've done so far is duplicate this modern form, the same two fields, and now we're going to dive into the date and time card for this form specifically. We're going to keep the date picker as is. I think it's actually a pretty good experience for users. The UI is nice. It seems easy enough to use. We're going to take a look at the hour dropdown, minute dropdown, and then we're going to add our own AM, PM dropdown. So the first thing I want to do is change the values of these dropdowns, what the options are for folks. So if you click on the hour value dropdown here, and yours might have a different name again, depending on, how many times you've imported this form or created this form. I've done it a few times. And if you go up here to the top left, you have the items selected, and these are all the items that currently appear in the dropdown that we're going to augment. So if you try to change things, I'm going to backspace here, it says you cannot edit in read-only editor. And so what we need to do is unlock this card, because these are values from SharePoint that they don't want you to be able to easily change if you're not meaning to. So if you come back over here to the right, click Advanced, you can then unlock to change properties, which we'll do. And now up here, you could change things as you wish. So if I were to get rid of all these, for example, and then take a look, now I just have 0 through 10 as my options. And what I want is 1 through 12 as our options. So I'm going to do that quickly. All right, we've made those changes. And now if you play the app, you'll see just 1 through 12. It has 00. And it's a good call out. I think that this is maybe the default item selected. So if you look over here on the right and go to default selected item, sure enough. So we selected it, made it the active property. It is going to take a look at what the parent default, so what you might have set in your SharePoint list, or it's going to pick kind of in this format, which is 00, is just kind of the format for this text. And so I think either in our SharePoint list, we either did not have a default value defined, or it was 0 o'clock at the time. So either way, instead of using the parent default, I'm going to comment it out again with just 2 leading slashes, and I want it to default to just 1 o'clock. Okay, cool. So now when somebody lands on your form, they'll see 1 o'clock, and then they can pick 1 through 12. So let's take a look at the minute dropdown. So again, here are all the options, 0 through 59. I like to restrict these values, again, on the 10 minute, on the 15 minute, whatever you think makes the most sense for your use case. So I'm going to keep 00 there, and I'm going to do 15, 30, and 45. And so this should cover most of the time periods for our event. Again, down to the minute's not often required, I think, for many things, unless you have very specific timing for your use case. And so we have a fine enough hour picker and minute picker, but we now need a way for folks to know whether it's AM or PM. So what I'm going to do is copy the minute selector. So if you press the selector, Control C and Control V, or copy paste, however you like it, it's going to copy it right on top of it. So it's actually a little bit tough to see. I'm going to make this larger, and then I'm just going to drag these a little smaller. And the reason that these move together is because their X position is relative to, I believe, this element, which is why they're always kind of hugging at the same distance. And so I'm going to look for this one, which you can't tell, again, it's on the top, but it is the new version of the minute selector. And so to avoid confusion, I'm going to change this to the AM PM dropdown. Cool. All right, we've got our AM PM dropdown, and now we need to change the values in it. So I have it selected. I'm going to come up here. Instead of our minute values, we're going to feed it either AM or PM as options. And then you'll still see 00 because that is the selected items that we had for a minute value. Don't need to preserve this, so I'm just going to clear it out, and we're going to feed it AM as its default value. So if we play this, we have a nice date picker, a 1 through 12 hour picker, a restricted minute picker with just a few options on the quarter hour, and a AM option and a PM option here in our dropdown. Now that we have our dropdown set up, we need to let SharePoint know how to interpret our data. So instead of feeding it a 24-hour value, we are going to feed it a 1 through 12 value, and then we're going to use AM and PM to determine whether it's kind of in the morning or afternoon. So more specifically, we're going to tell Power Apps how to kind of convert our data and give that to SharePoint. So if you click on the card, the date and time card, come up here to update, you will see this big, very hard to read function, just a big if statement. If your code is valid, which this is valid because it's just the default code, you can actually click Format Text, and it'll make this much more readable to you. So this is just an if function that says if this is not blank, which is your date picker, so if it actually has a value, then this is what it's going to update with, the value for this card. And so date and time is a Power Apps function, which converts a number of different values into kind of one big date and time string. So if you click date and time, you can actually see it down here, kind of the format that it ends up using: a month, day, year, and then hour. So let's update the update property with our own formula. So the first thing I like to do is remove formatting, which puts everything back on one line, and I can just comment it out. And then if I screw something up in the future, I can go back and reference that. And what we are going to do is actually use kind of a similar strategy in the sense that I like the if check that was given to us by default, which just says, hey, before you generate a value, just make sure that your date picker is not blank. So let's have that there. And then assuming we have a date and we're ready to generate like a full date and time value, we're going to use a slightly different approach from the date time function used in the default formula. And we're going to use the date time value function. And so what this does is it converts a text string to a number that represents a Power Apps datetime code. And that datetime code is understood by Power Apps and it's understood by SharePoint, which is great. So we're going to give it some text. It's going to convert it kind of in the background to the right type of value, the right type of data, and then send that to SharePoint, which is great. So if I do that, we need to send it a text string in a very specific format. And so the format that SharePoint expects, and Power Apps, I believe, is this format right here. So it expects a month, a day, a year, space, the hour, a colon, minutes, another space, and then an AM or PM value. So what we want to do firstly is let's get the date worked out. So again, we're going to kind of send this datetime value function one long string, and we're going to just kind of do it in pieces. And then we're going to kind of concatenate it together until we have one long text string, which then is understood by this formula and converted to the appropriate Power Apps and SharePoint data type. All right, first things first, we need to get our date value here. The first part of our full text string is going to be our date value. And to do that, we need to convert the value that we receive from this date input into text, because it's not going to be in text by default. So I am going to use the text function to do this. This will take in a different format and it will convert it to text, which is great. And what we care about is date value 5, which is the name of this particular widget. Easy on the left here as well. And you can get the full date by using the selected date property. And we want to not only get that date, but we want to format it in a specific fashion. So we want it in the MMDDYYYY format, which is going to be 2 digits for 2 characters for month, day, and then a full year. And that gives us the full date value. And now we're going to start concatenating things. So we're using the ampersand, which is just going to say, hey, combine these series of texts together into one long string. And so we're done with this part. We now have a space. So we do explicitly want to say there's a space. And the next thing we need is here, our hour value. So we're going to get that from the hour value 5 dropdown. Again, that's the name given to this dropdown. Selected.value. And what's great is this is already in text format. You can see it down here, the data type text. So we don't need to use the text function because it's already there. We're going to use an ampersand again. And now we need to add a colon. Again, now we're right here in our format, a colon. And we're going to concatenate that with our minute value. Again, minute value 5, dot selected, dot value. This is also in text, which is great. And we are now here. So we do need one more space. So I'm just going to copy this here. And the last thing we need to feed it is the either AM or PM value. And in this case, that's going to come from our new dropdown that we created. And we called it AM PM dropdown. selected.value. And so let's close out these functions. And now we have no errors, which is great. So let's test it and make sure that SharePoint receives the correct date and time value that our user inputs. So let's play our app. And again, we only really care about this. This button currently is set up to submit this form specifically, and then it resets. So let's do a morning event. And we'll say that tomorrow, 6:30 a.m., this event's going to happen. So again, it's going to submit, and then it'll clear out back to our default values. So if I come over here and go to our SharePoint list, let's refresh this. Here's our value. So tomorrow at 6:30, that's great. And now we want to check if our PM value works. So maybe this is an afternoon event, and we'll say that this is on the 9th, and it's going to be a late event, 10:45 p.m. Again, we're going to submit this, come back over, take a look. Here's our afternoon event. And now SharePoint correctly understood that our event is in the afternoon. And this created just an easier way we have found for many of our clients that are not used to the 24-hour clock to be able to tell us more explicitly when a sunrise piece of content, announcement, an event is going to be scheduled for. All right, folks, that does it for this video. Ultimately, it doesn't matter what date and time picker you use. What really matters is that your stakeholders understand how their data is inputted and what that translates to. So if they're not familiar with using the 24-hour picker, you may decide to do something like we've done here in this video. But if it works great out of the box, then I think that's awesome. So as long as they know what's going on and SharePoint gets the correct date and time from your Power Apps form, then you're good to go. We will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.